Hey all, tonight we're diving into a fascinating journey through one of history's darkest yet most transformative periods. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake to the violent lurching of wooden planks beneath your body, your stomach immediately churning with the familiar nausea that has plagued you for weeks. The air around you is thick with the stench of unwashed bodies, stale urine, and the sickle-sweet smell of rotting food mixed with bilge water. Your clothes, what remains of them, cling to your skin with a dampness that never seems to dry, a combination of seawater, sweat, and moisture that seeps up from the ship's bowels where you sleep among 30 other men in a space barely large enough for half that number at 1718, and you are aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge, though the irony of that name isn't lost on you as you feel anything but vengeful in this moment. Your body aches from sleeping on the hard wooden deck, using a coil of rope as a pillow, and your back bears the permanent impression of the ship's ribs against your spine. Around you, other members of the crew are stirring, some coughing violently, others groaning as they attempt to work feeling back into limbs that have gone numb from the cold and dampness. The sound that woke you was the harsh clang of the ship's bell, calling all hands to their morning duties. But morning is a relative term here in the perpetual twilight of the gun deck, where portholes are sealed tight to prevent water from flooding in during rough seas. The only light comes from a few flickering candles housed in horn lanterns, casting dancing shadows that make the already cramped space feel even more claustrophobic. You push yourself to your feet, your joints protesting with sharp pains that remind you that you're only 23 years old, though you feel decades older. The constant dampness has seeped into your bones, and what started as minor aches when you first came aboard 6 months ago have developed into a persistent, gnawing pain that radiates through your entire body. Your hands, once smooth from your previous life as a carpenter's apprentice in Port Royal, are now cracked and bleeding from the constant exposure to salt water and rough rope. The man sleeping next to you, Jonas, a former merchant sailor who joined the crew after his ship was captured 3 months ago, struggles to his feet beside you. His left leg bears an ugly wound from a cutlass that never properly healed, and the infection has spread, creating red streaks that climb up toward his knee. He winces with each step, but complaining about injury aboard a pirate ship is a luxury none of you can afford. Weakness is seen as liability, and liability gets you marooned on some godforsaken stretch of sand with nothing but a pistol and a single shot. The stench intensifies as you make your way toward the ladder leading to the upper deck. The bilge water has been rising again, and you can see rats, dozens of them, scurrying through the murky water that sloshes back and forth with each movement of the ship. These rats are your constant companions, bold creatures that have grown fat on the ship's meager stores and have no fear of the men who share their floating prison. They climb over sleeping sailors at night, and more than once you've woken to find one of them nibbling at your hair or clothes. Your stomach clenches with hunger, but you know that relief is still hours away. The crew eats twice a day if they're lucky, a morning meal of hardtack and whatever meat hasn't yet spoiled, and an evening meal of the same. The hardtack itself is a testament to how desperate your situation has become. These rock-hard biscuits are riddled with weevils and other insects, and you've learned to tap them against the deck before eating to knock out the worst of the infestation. When food is this scarce, you can't afford to be particular about a few extra insects. The water situation is even more dire. The barrels of fresh water that seemed so abundant when you first set sail have dwindled to a precious few, and what remains has taken on a greenish tint and tastes of algae and decay. Each man is rationed a single cup of this foul liquid per day, barely enough to keep you alive in the tropical heat. Your lips are constantly cracked, your mouth perpetually dry, and you've learned to collect rainwater in whatever containers you can find, even drinking from puddles that form on the deck during storms. As you climb the ladder toward the upper deck, your hand slips on a rung made slick with some unidentifiable moisture. You catch yourself, but not before your palm is sliced open by a splinter of wood that tears through your already damaged skin. Blood wells up immediately, mixing with the salt spray that constantly coats every surface of the ship. You wrap the wound with a piece of torn cloth from your shirt, the same shirt you've been wearing for 2 months now, and continue climbing. The upper deck offers little relief from the misery below. The Caribbean sun, which once seemed so inviting when you first dreamed of a pirate's life, now beats down with merciless intensity. The deck planks are so hot that you can feel the heat through the worn soles of your boots, and there's precious little shade to be found. The sails above provide some relief, but the captain keeps most of the crew working in the full sun, and the combination of heat and dehydration has already claimed 2 men who collapsed and never rose again. Your job for the morning is to help repair the rigging that was damaged during last night's storm. This means climbing high into the ship's masts, balancing on ropes and wooden beams while the ship rocks violently beneath you. One wrong step, one moment of lost balance, and you'll plummet to the deck below, if you're lucky. More likely, you'll be thrown clear of the ship and into the ocean, where no one will risk the danger of turning around to rescue you. The rope work requires you to use your hands constantly, and the rough hemp fibers tear at your already damaged palms and fingers. Within minutes of beginning work, your wounds have reopened, and blood makes the rope slippery and dangerous. But there's no choice but to continue. The rigging must be repaired, or the ship can't sail, and a ship that can't sail is a ship that can't find food, water, or prey. Thomas Wickham, the ship's quartermaster, approaches as you work. Wickham is a hard man made harder by years at sea, his face permanently burned by the sun and marked with scars from countless battles. His left eye is clouded white from a sword cut that barely missed killing him, and his hands are missing 2 fingers from various encounters with enemy blades. He examines your work with the critical eye of someone whose life depends on every knot being properly tied, every rope properly secured. Faster, Thompson, he growls, his voice hoarse from years of shouting over ocean winds. We've spotted a merchant vessel on the horizon, and the captain wants to be ready to give chase within the hour. The news sends a ripple of excitement through the nearby crew members, but you feel only dread. A chase means violence, and violence means the very real possibility that today could be your last. You've been part of 3 ship attacks since joining the crew, and each one has left you more shaken than the last. The romantic notion of piracy that first drew you to this life, tales of adventure and easy wealth, has been replaced by the harsh reality of what it means to survive by theft and murder. The first merchant ship you helped capture had a crew of 12 men, including 2 boys who couldn't have been older than 14. You watched those boys beg for their lives before they were cut down by your crewmates, their blood mixing with the seawater that constantly washes across the deck. The memory of their faces haunts your dreams when you're able to sleep. Most nights, you lie awake listening to the sounds of the ship, the creaking of wood under stress, the constant splash of waves against the hull, the coughing and moaning of sick crew members, and sometimes the screams of men having nightmares about the horrors they've witnessed or participated in. As you continue working on the rigging, you notice that your hands are shaking. At first, you assume it's from fatigue or the constant motion of the ship, but then you recognize the tremor as something more serious. Several of the crew have developed similar shakes over the past weeks, along with loose teeth and bleeding gums. You've heard older sailors talk about scurvy, the disease that kills more pirates than any navy or rival crew. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables has begun its slow work of destroying your body from the inside out. The irony isn't lost on you that while you're surrounded by water, clean drinking water is becoming increasingly scarce. The ship's supply was already running low when you captured those last 2 merchant vessels, but neither of them carried sufficient fresh water to replenish your stores. The captain has been pushing the crew harder, looking for a port where you can resupply, but finding a safe harbor is becoming increasingly difficult. Word has spread throughout the Caribbean about your ship and its crew. The Queen Anne's Revenge has gained a reputation for particular brutality, partly due to the captain's belief that terror is more effective than mercy in convincing merchant crews to surrender without a fight. This reputation precedes you into every port, making it impossible to resupply in any civilized harbor. Instead, you are forced to rely on hidden coves and the occasional encounter with other pirate ships for supplies. That isolation is perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of your current existence. You've been at sea for 6 months without setting foot on solid ground, without seeing a friendly face that isn't part of this floating prison. The crew has become a family of sorts, bound together by shared misery and mutual dependence, but it's a dysfunctional family marked by violence, suspicion, and the constant threat of betrayal. Just last week, you witnessed the flogging of Samuel Hayes, a sailor who was caught stealing extra rations from the ship's stores. The punishment was severe, 50 lashes with a cat-o'-nine-tails that left his back a bloody mess of torn flesh. Hayes survived, but he's been unable to work since, and there's talk among the crew about whether he's becoming too much of a burden to keep alive. In your previous life, such talk would have seemed monstrous, but here it's just another aspect of the harsh calculus of survival. The cat-o'-nine-tails itself is a weapon designed specifically for inflicting maximum pain without immediately killing the victim. Each of the 9 rope strands is tipped with metal or bone, and when wielded by someone skilled in its use, it can flay skin from bone while keeping the victim conscious throughout the ordeal. You've seen it used 3 times since joining the crew, and each time you've been forced to watch as a reminder of what happens to those who break the ship's rules. The ship's rules, known as the articles, are posted prominently near the mainmast where everyone can see them. These aren't the romantic codes of honor depicted in popular tales, but brutal regulations designed to maintain order among men who have already demonstrated their willingness to live outside society's laws. Theft from fellow crew members is punishable by death or marooning. Desertion results in death. Cowardice in battle leads to flogging or worse, but perhaps most troubling are the unwritten rules that govern daily life aboard the ship. The strong prey upon the weak with impunity, and as one of the newer members of the crew, you occupy a position near the bottom of the ship's harsh hierarchy. Your food rations are often reduced when supplies run low, you're assigned the most dangerous tasks during storms and battles, and you have no voice in the ship's democratic decision-making process that determines everything from your next target to punishment for rule breakers. The democratic aspect of pirate ships is one of the few elements that matches popular legends, but the reality is far different from romantic notions of equality and brotherhood. Yes, the crew votes on major decisions, but those votes are heavily influenced by whoever can intimidate or bribe the most supporters. The captain's authority is supposedly subject to crew approval, but Captain Blackbeard, whose real name is Edward Teach, maintains his position through a combination of charisma, cunning, and the very real threat of violence against anyone who opposes him. You've seen Blackbeard's temper firsthand, and it's a terrifying thing to witness. During a dispute over the division of loot from your last capture, he drew his pistol and shot one of his own crew members through the knee, simply to demonstrate that even his own men weren't safe from his wrath. The wounded sailor, a man named Peters who had served aboard pirate ships for over a decade, screamed in agony as the bone shattered, but Blackbeard simply stepped over him and continued the meeting as if nothing had happened. The medical care available aboard the ship is primitive at best and often more dangerous than the original injury. The ship's surgeon, if he can be called that, is a former barber named Edmund Cartwright who learned his trade by practicing on wounded pirates. His instruments are crude and dirty, his knowledge limited to basic amputation and crude wound treatment, and his hands shake from a constant intake of rum that he claims steadies his nerves but actually makes him increasingly unreliable. You've seen Cartwright perform amputations using a rusty saw and no anesthetic except whatever rum the patient can consume before the procedure. The screams that emerge from his makeshift surgery area below deck are sounds you'll never forget, grown men reduced to howling animals by pain that goes beyond anything the human mind was designed to endure. Many patients die from shock or infection, and those who survive are often left worse off than before. The dental situation aboard the ship is equally horrific. Most of the crew suffers from severe tooth decay and gum disease, partly due to the poor diet but also because of the complete absence of any dental care. Men walk around with abscessed teeth that cause constant pain, and the only treatment available is extraction with crude pliers. You've watched crew members hold down a screaming shipmate while Cartwright yanks infected teeth from their heads, often breaking off roots and leaving fragments that continue to cause pain and infection. Your own teeth have begun to loosen and bleed, a sure sign that scurvy is taking hold. Each morning when you wake, you run your tongue over your teeth to check for new damage, and each morning you find the situation slightly worse. The constant pain makes eating difficult, which compounds the malnutrition that's causing the dental problems in the first place. The psychological effects of your situation are perhaps even worse than the physical hardships. The constant threat of violence, the isolation from civilized society, and the daily witnessing of brutality have begun to change you in ways that frighten you. You find yourself thinking thoughts that would have appalled your former self, wondering whether it would be better to simply throw yourself overboard rather than continue enduring this existence, or considering whether you could murder a fellow crew member in his sleep to steal his extra ration. Sleep, when it comes at all, brings no relief. The cramped quarters below deck mean that you're constantly pressed against other men, feeling their movement, hearing their breathing, smelling their unwashed bodies. Privacy is a concept that simply doesn't exist aboard a pirate ship. You eat, sleep, work, and relieve yourself in full view of your crewmates, and they do the same. the loss of personal dignity is complete and absolute. The toilet facilities aboard the ship consist of a crude seat suspended over the ocean at the bow of the ship, euphemistically called the head. Using these facilities requires balancing precariously over churning water while the ship pitches and rolls, and more than one sailor has fallen to his death while attending to basic bodily functions. The constant spray of salt water provides a crude form of cleaning, but the lack of privacy and the dangerous conditions make even this basic human need a source of stress and potential disaster. Personal hygiene becomes impossible under these conditions. Bathing means jumping overboard while the ship is anchored, risking shark attack, drowning, or simply being left behind if the captain decides to sail while you're in the water. Most crew members simply accept that they'll remain filthy for the duration of their time at sea, and the accumulation of dirt, sweat, and grime becomes a layer of protection against the sun and salt spray. Your clothing, such as it is, has deteriorated to the point where it barely covers your body. The combination of salt water, constant wear, and the absence of any means to repair or replace garments means that most of the crew walks around in rags that would shame the poorest beggar in any civilized port. Your own shirt has holes large enough to put your fist through, and your trousers are held together by pieces of rope tied around your waist. The heat during the day is oppressive, but the nights bring their own misery. The tropical sun that bakes the deck during daylight hours gives way to surprisingly cold nights, and without proper clothing or bedding, you shiver until dawn in the damp air. The ship provides no blankets or hammocks for common crew members. Such luxuries are reserved for officers and those who have earned them through violence or particular skill. Food preparation aboard the ship is a constant source of illness and disgust. The ship's cook, a man known only as Portuguese Joe, works with ingredients that would be rejected by any sensible person on land. Meat that has begun to rot is considered acceptable as long as the maggots can be scraped off. Hardtack riddled with weevils is standard fare. Water that has turned green with algae is mixed with rum to mask the taste and hopefully kill some of the harmful organisms it contains. The cooking is done in a galley that's barely large enough for one person to work in, using a fire that's constantly in danger of being extinguished by spray or rain. Portuguese Joe has lost most of his fingers to various accidents with knives and fire, and his remaining digits are permanently stained black from handling rotting food and dirty cookware. The meals he produces are barely edible even by the standards of desperate men, but they represent the difference between life and death in your current circumstances. Meal times themselves are exercises in controlled violence. There's never enough food to satisfy everyone's hunger, and the distribution is based on a hierarchy that places new crew members at the bottom. You wait until everyone else has been served before approaching the cook's cauldron, and by then what remains is usually the worst portions, gristle, bone, and whatever scraps the others have rejected. Fights over food are common, and you've learned to eat quickly and defensively, always watching for someone who might try to steal from your plate. The rats that infest the ship have become so bold that they compete directly with the crew for food. These creatures have grown large and aggressive on a diet of ship's stores and whatever scraps they can steal, and they show no fear of humans. You've woken to find rats eating food from your very hands, and shooting them is impossible below deck due to the risk of fire or damaging the ship's hull. Water rationing has become so severe that you dream about fresh, clean drinking water more often than you dream about home or family. The single cup of foul water you're allowed each day barely keeps you alive, and the temptation to steal from the ship's dwindling supplies grows stronger every day. You've seen men risk flogging or death for an extra sip of water, and you understand their desperation because you feel it yourself. The constant dehydration affects everything about your daily existence. Your thinking becomes sluggish, your reflexes slow, and your ability to perform the physical labor required aboard the ship deteriorates steadily. Simple tasks that would have been easy in your former life now require enormous effort and concentration. Climbing the rigging, which was challenging when you were healthy, has become genuinely dangerous as your strength and coordination fail. The work itself is relentless and dangerous. A sailing ship requires constant maintenance and attention, and there are never enough healthy crew members to handle all the necessary tasks. You might spend the morning repairing sails torn by storms, the afternoon swabbing decks to prevent the accumulation of algae and rot, and the evening splicing rope or tarring the rigging to protect it from salt water damage. Each of these tasks carries its own risks and hardships. Sail repair requires working with needles and heavy canvas while the ship pitches and rolls, often resulting in puncture wounds that become infected in the salt air. Deck swabbing means constant exposure to harsh chemicals and the risk of slipping on wet surfaces. rope work destroys your hands and forearms with countless small cuts and burns from the rough hemp fibers. The most dangerous work involves going aloft to work on the ship's rigging during storms or high winds. You've learned to move through the complex web of ropes and wooden beams that support the ship's sails, but every trip up the mast is a potential death sentence. The ship's motion is amplified the higher you climb, and holding on requires strength that's increasingly difficult to maintain on your inadequate diet. During your second month aboard the ship, you watched a sailor named Thomas Murphy fall from the mainmast during a storm. He struck the deck with a sound you'll never forget, a wet crack that spoke of bone shattering and life ending instantly. His body lay where it fell for nearly an hour while the crew finished dealing with the storm emergency, and when they finally had time to examine him, they found that his neck had been broken and his skull crushed. They wrapped him in a piece of old sail and threw him overboard without ceremony, pausing only long enough to strip his body of anything useful. Murphy's death affected you more than you expected. He had been one of the few crew members who showed any kindness to newcomers, sharing his knowledge of knots and sailing techniques with those who needed help. His loss removed one of the small sources of humanity in your harsh environment, and his position was filled by promoting another crew member who showed no such charitable inclinations. The hierarchy aboard the ship is enforced through a system of violence and intimidation that would be illegal in any civilized society. Senior crew members have absolute authority over those below them, and they exercise this authority with arbitrary cruelty. You've been struck, kicked, and verbally abused for infractions as minor as being too slow to respond to orders or failing to properly maintain your equipment. Physical punishment aboard the ship goes far beyond the formal floggings prescribed by the ship's articles. Casual violence is a daily occurrence, and crew members use their fists, feet, and whatever weapons are handy to maintain order and settle disputes. You've learned to keep your head down and avoid eye contact with anyone who might interpret your behavior as challenging their authority. The ship's officers occupy a different world from the common crew members. They have private quarters, better food, cleaner clothing, and access to medical care that's denied to the rest of the crew. The captain's cabin is furnished with stolen luxury items, fine furniture, expensive clothing, cases of wine and spirits, and even books and navigational instruments that represent wealth beyond anything you could hope to accumulate. Captain Blackbeard himself is a figure who inspires both fear and grudging admiration among the crew. His reputation for violence and cunning is well deserved, but he also possesses a charisma and intelligence that explain how he's maintained command of such a dangerous group of men. He's tall and powerfully built, with a black beard that he sometimes decorates with lit slow matches to create a demonic appearance during battles. You've spoken directly with Blackbeard only twice since joining the crew, and both conversations left you shaken. His eyes are those of a man who has seen and done things that would drive normal people insane, and his voice carries the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. He speaks to common crew members with the casual indifference of someone addressing livestock, and you understand that your life has no more value to him than that of the rats that infest the ship's hold. The captain's moods are unpredictable and dangerous. You've seen him laugh uproariously at the suffering of captured enemies, then fly into homicidal rage over minor infractions by his own crew. His punishments are creative and brutal. He once had a crew member's hand nailed to the mainmast for stealing rum, leaving the man to hang there until his hand tore free, permanently crippling him but serving as a warning to others. The ship's first mate, a Scotsman named Robert McLean, serves as the captain's primary enforcer and shares his taste for violence. McLean is missing his left arm from an encounter with a Spanish warship, but he's learned to use this disability as a weapon, employing the stump to deliver devastating blows that can knock a man unconscious. His remaining hand carries a curved cutlass that never seems to leave his side, and he's quick to draw it when he feels his authority is being challenged. The quartermaster, Thomas Wickham, manages the ship's supplies and oversees the distribution of food, water, and other necessities. This position gives him enormous power over the crew's daily existence, and he uses this power to maintain his own network of favorites and enemies. Those who stay in Wickham's good graces receive slightly larger rations and easier work assignments, while those who cross him find themselves facing hunger and the most dangerous tasks aboard the ship. The ship's navigator, a former merchant marine named William Porter, possesses knowledge that makes him invaluable despite his obvious reluctance to embrace the pirate lifestyle. Porter was captured when his merchant vessel was taken 6 months ago, and he's been forced to serve as navigator ever since. His skills keep the ship from becoming lost at sea, but his evident disgust with the crew's activities makes him a target for abuse and suspicion. You've noticed that Porter never fully participates in the crew celebrations after successful raids, and he often stares out at the horizon with an expression of longing that suggests he's thinking about the life he was forced to abandon. His isolation among the crew mirrors your own feelings of displacement, but his specialized skills protect him from the worst abuse that newer crew members face. The ship's carpenter, an elderly man known as Philadelphia Pete, maintains the vessel's structure and makes repairs when damage occurs during storms or battles. His workshop below deck is one of the few areas that maintain some semblance of order and cleanliness, and his tools are kept in better condition than any other equipment aboard the ship. Pete's knowledge of woodworking and ship construction makes him another indispensable crew member, and his age and expertise earn him a degree of respect that's rare aboard the vessel. You've spent time helping Pete with repairs, and these periods represent some of the closest things to normal human interaction you've experienced since joining the crew. Pete treats his helpers with patience and respect, sharing his knowledge freely and never resorting to the casual violence that characterizes most interactions aboard the ship. His workshop becomes a refuge where you can momentarily forget the horror of your situation and focus on constructive activity. But even Pete's relative kindness comes with reminders of the harsh realities you face. His hands are permanently stained with blood from treating wounded crew members who seek his help when the ship's surgeon is too drunk to function. He's seen so many men die from wounds, disease, and violence that he's developed a philosophical detachment that sometimes makes him seem as cold as the other officers. The ship's stores, managed by Quartermaster Wickham, represent a constant source of anxiety for the crew. Food supplies dwindle daily, and there's no guarantee that the next prize will carry sufficient provisions to keep everyone alive. Water is even more critical, as the ship can survive without food longer than it can survive without drinking water. The barrels in the hold are marked with dates and quality ratings, and watching these supplies diminish creates a psychological pressure that affects everyone's behavior. Medical supplies are virtually non-existent. The ship carries a small stock of rum for treating wounds, some crude surgical instruments that double as carpentry tools, and a few herbs and powders of questionable effectiveness. Serious injuries or illnesses are essentially death sentences, and the crew has learned to view wounded or sick members as burdens rather than people deserving care and treatment. The absence of proper medical care means that minor injuries often become life-threatening infections. A small cut from rope work can develop into a festering wound that spreads poison throughout the body. Broken bones heal improperly without setting, leaving crew members permanently disabled. Diseases spread rapidly through the crowded quarters, and once someone becomes seriously ill, their chances of recovery are minimal. You've watched several crew members die from illnesses that would be easily treatable on land. A sailor named Jenkins developed what appeared to be a simple fever, but within a week he was delirious and burning with heat that no amount of cool water could reduce. He died raving about his mother and childhood home, and his body was thrown overboard the same day to prevent the spread of whatever had killed him. The psychological impact of watching people die in such circumstances is cumulative and devastating. Each death reinforces your understanding of how precarious your own survival has become, and the casual way the crew disposes of bodies speaks to how completely the ship's environment strips away normal human empathy and compassion. The ship's armament represents both your means of survival and a constant source of danger. The cannons that line the gun deck are poorly maintained and unreliable, prone to misfiring or exploding when loaded with the inferior gunpowder available to pirate crews. You've learned to operate these weapons, but you do so with the knowledge that they're as likely to kill you as they are to damage an enemy vessel. Personal weapons are in equally poor condition. Your cutlass is rusty and nicked from use, its edge maintained through crude sharpening that's gradually wearing the blade away. Your pistol is an old flintlock that misfires more often than it shoots true, and finding dry gunpowder to load it is becoming increasingly difficult in the ship's humid environment. The preparation for battle involves checking and rechecking these unreliable weapons while trying to ignore the very real possibility that you'll be killed in the upcoming fight. Loading cannons with gunpowder that might explode prematurely, sharpening blades that might break under stress, and cleaning firearms that might misfire at critical moments, all of these activities serve as reminders that your survival depends on equipment that's inadequate for the tasks it must perform. When battle does come, the reality bears no resemblance to the romantic tales of swashbuckling adventure that first drew you to the pirate life. Combat aboard sailing ships is chaotic, terrifying, and brutal, with outcomes determined as much by luck as by skill or courage. Cannonballs tear through human bodies with devastating effect, turning proud warriors into screaming, bloody fragments in an instant. Your first battle as a crew member involved attacking a Spanish merchant vessel carrying sugar and rum from Barbados to Seville. The fight lasted less than an hour, but those 60 minutes contained more violence and horror than you had witnessed in your entire previous life. You watched men you knew cut down by enemy swords, saw others torn apart by cannon fire, and participated in the systematic murder of merchant sailors who had surrendered and begged for mercy. The aftermath of battle is somehow worse than the combat itself. The deck is slick with blood that mixes with seawater to create a pink foam that sticks to everything it touches. Body parts from dismembered crew members and enemies alike are scattered across the ship, and the job of cleaning up falls to whoever is still alive and able to work. You've learned to step over severed limbs and mutilated corpses as if they were pieces of debris, and this casual acceptance of carnage represents perhaps the most disturbing change in your character since joining the crew. The division of captured wealth follows strict protocols established by the ship's articles, but these rules favor senior crew members and officers while leaving newcomers with minimal shares. After risking your life in combat, you might receive a handful of coins or a piece of cloth that represents a tiny fraction of the treasure gained through your efforts. The inequality is stark and demoralizing, serving as a constant reminder of your low status within the ship's hierarchy. More importantly, the treasure itself often proves disappointing compared to the effort and risk required to obtain it. Merchant ships don't always carry the gold and silver depicted in popular tales. More often they transport goods like sugar, tobacco, or manufactured items that are difficult to convert into useful currency. Even when valuable cargo is captured, finding buyers for stolen goods requires connections and knowledge that common pirates don't possess. The romantic notion of buried treasure is largely fantasy created by the practical realities of pirate economics. Burying valuable items requires finding secure locations and remembering their positions, both difficult tasks for crews that are constantly moving and often drunk. More commonly, captured wealth is divided immediately and spent as quickly as possible on supplies, rum, and whatever pleasure can be purchased during brief stops in friendly ports. The constant threat of capture by naval forces adds another layer of stress to daily life aboard the pirate ship. Every sail on the horizon might belong to a warship sent specifically to hunt down your vessel, and the penalties for piracy are severe enough to motivate desperate resistance even when faced with overwhelming odds. You've learned to recognize the distinctive profiles of naval vessels and to understand the tactical implications of different wind conditions and sea states during potential encounters. The Royal Navy's anti-piracy efforts have intensified dramatically in recent years, with dedicated squadrons assigned to patrol the Caribbean and hunt down known pirate vessels. These warships are better armed, better maintained, and crewed by professional sailors who fight with the discipline and coordination that pirate crews lack. When naval vessels appear, the usual response is to flee rather than fight, but escape isn't always possible. The psychological pressure of being constantly hunted affects everyone aboard the ship differently. Some crew members become fatalistic, accepting that capture and execution are inevitable and focusing on enjoying whatever time remains to them. Others become increasingly paranoid, seeing threats in every cloud on the horizon and jumping at unexpected sounds. A few retreat into fantasy, convincing themselves that their pirate career will end in wealth and comfort despite all evidence to the contrary. Your own response has been to focus obsessively on learning every aspect of seamanship and survival skills that might help you escape your current situation. You've studied navigation techniques by watching Porter work with his charts and instruments. You've learned to identify edible plants and sources of fresh water from conversations with crew members who have spent time ashore. Most importantly, you've begun to plan for the possibility of desertion if the opportunity ever presents itself. Desertion carries the death penalty according to the ship's articles, but the alternative, remaining aboard until the inevitable violent end, seems equally fatal. The challenge lies in finding an opportunity to escape that doesn't result in immediate recapture and execution. Island stops are brief and heavily guarded, making it nearly impossible to slip away unnoticed. Swimming to shore is suicidal given the distances involved and the presence of sharks in Caribbean waters. The ship's stops for water and supplies have become increasingly rare and brief as Blackbeard's reputation makes it difficult to find ports willing to trade with known pirates. When stops do occur, they're usually at remote islands or hidden coves where other pirates gather to trade information and supplies. These gatherings provide opportunities to hear news from the outside world, but they also expose you to even more violent and desperate men than your current crewmates. The pirate gatherings at places like Nassau and Tortuga reveal the full scope of the criminal underworld that has emerged in the Caribbean. Here you encounter men who have committed acts of violence and depravity that make your own crew seem almost civilized by comparison. Stories are told of tortures inflicted on captured prisoners, of entire merchant crews murdered for sport, and of pirate captains who have descended into madness from years of violence and isolation. During your last visit to such a gathering, you witnessed a dispute between two pirate crews that escalated into a battle that left dozens of men dead on the beach. The fight began over the division of captured goods but quickly became a demonstration of the barely contained violence that characterizes interactions between desperate men with nothing left to lose. Bodies were left where they fell, picked clean by crabs and birds, serving as warnings to future visitors about the consequences of conflict. The women you encounter in these pirate havens are often as desperate and dangerous as the men they serve. Many are escaped slaves, former prisoners, or refugees from various colonial disasters who have found that survival requires embracing the same violent pragmatism that governs pirate society. They work as tavern keepers, suppliers, and companions, but always with weapons close at hand and the knowledge that their safety depends on their ability to defend themselves. Your brief encounters with these women provide painful reminders of the civilized world you've left behind. Some retain vestiges of education and refinement that speak to their former lives, and their presence emphasizes how far you've fallen from your original aspirations. Conversations with them reveal the broader social and economic forces that drive people to piracy, poverty, oppression, and the absence of legitimate opportunities for advancement in colonial society. The economic system of the pirate world operates on principles completely different from legitimate commerce. Value is determined by immediate utility rather than long-term investment potential. Food and fresh water command premium prices, while luxury items that would be valuable on land often go unsold because they serve no practical purpose in the harsh environment of pirate life. The currency of pirate society is violence and reputation rather than gold or silver. A crew member's worth is measured by his willingness to kill and his ability to survive combat, not by his accumulated wealth or specialized skills. This system creates incentives for increasingly brutal behavior as men compete for status and resources within their harsh hierarchy. The constant presence of disease adds another dimension of misery to life aboard the pirate ship. Tropical ailments that are manageable with proper medical care become fatal in the ship's environment. Yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery spread rapidly through the crowded quarters, and once someone becomes seriously ill, their chances of recovery are minimal without access to proper medicine and clean conditions. You've watched the progression of various diseases through your crewmates with the detached interest of someone who knows he might be next. The yellow fever that killed 3 men last month began with symptoms that seemed minor: slight fever, headache, nausea, but quickly progressed to the characteristic yellowing of skin and eyes that gives the disease its name. The victims suffered agonizing deaths, vomiting blood and writhing in delirium as their organs failed. Malaria presents a different but equally devastating pattern of illness. The intermittent fevers and chills that characterize this disease gradually weaken victims until they become unable to perform the physical labor required aboard the ship. Those who survive the acute phase often suffer recurring episodes that make them unreliable crew members, leading to abuse and eventual abandonment. Dysentery, perhaps the most common ailment aboard the ship, results from the poor sanitation and contaminated food that characterize daily life. The bloody diarrhea and severe dehydration that mark this illness are compounded by the ship's lack of clean water and proper facilities for caring for the sick. Victims waste away slowly, becoming skeletal figures who eventually lack the strength to leave their sleeping areas. The ship's response to serious illness is pragmatic and brutal. Crew members who become too sick to work are often simply thrown overboard, both to prevent the spread of disease and to conserve limited resources for those who can still contribute to the ship's survival. You've participated in such disposal of human beings, justifying your actions by telling yourself that the victims were already dying and that keeping them aboard would endanger everyone else. The psychological defense mechanisms you develop to cope with such situations disturb you when you have time to reflect on them. You've learned to view fellow human beings as resources to be managed rather than individuals deserving compassion and care. This emotional numbing represents a form of survival adaptation, but it also marks a fundamental change in your character that you fear may be permanent. Sleep deprivation compounds all the other hardships you face aboard the ship. The combination of cramped quarters, constant noise, irregular work schedules, and persistent anxiety makes restful sleep nearly impossible. You exist in a state of chronic exhaustion that affects your judgment, reflexes, and emotional stability in ways that increase the danger of your already perilous situation. The dreams that come during your brief periods of unconsciousness often focus on your former life on land. You dream of fresh bread, clean clothes, comfortable beds, and conversations with people who treat you as a human being rather than a tool for violence and theft. These dreams provide temporary escape from your current reality, but waking up makes the contrast even more painful and the temptation to despair even stronger. The noise aboard the ship is constant and overwhelming. The creaking of wood under stress, the splash of waves against the hull, the shouts of crew members, the groans of wounded or sick men, and the scurrying of rats create a cacophony that penetrates every moment of existence. Your ears have adapted to filter out some of this noise, but the constant assault on your senses contributes to a general feeling of disorientation and stress. The smell aboard the ship has become so pervasive that you've largely stopped noticing it, but occasionally a shift in wind or a brief moment on deck reminds you of how thoroughly the stench has penetrated everything you own. Your clothes, your hair, your skin, everything carries the odor of unwashed bodies, rotting food, human waste, and the general decay that characterizes life in the ship's confined spaces. Personal possessions have taken on exaggerated importance in an environment where ownership is constantly threatened and nothing can be taken for granted. Your few remaining belongings, a broken comb, a piece of cloth that serves as a blanket, a small knife for eating, represent connections to your former identity and sources of comfort in an otherwise hostile environment. The knife, in particular, has become both tool and talisman. Its practical uses include eating, basic repairs to clothing and equipment, and self-defense in the constant low-level conflicts that characterize crew interactions. But beyond its utility, the knife represents your determination to maintain some degree of personal agency and self-respect despite the systematic degradation of your circumstances. The relationship between crew members oscillates between cooperation necessary for survival and competition for limited resources. You've learned to form temporary alliances with other crew members when mutual benefit can be achieved, but you've also learned that these alliances can dissolve instantly when resources become scarce or when individual survival interests conflict. Trust aboard the ship is a luxury that few can afford. Every crew member represents both a potential ally and a potential threat, and maintaining the balance between cooperation and self-protection requires constant vigilance and careful calculation. You've seen friendships formed over weeks of shared hardship destroyed in moments when hunger or fear override human compassion. The ship's hierarchy extends beyond formal ranks to include complex networks of obligation, intimidation, and mutual dependence that govern daily interactions. Understanding these relationships and your place within them requires careful observation and political skills that you never needed in your former life. Misjudging someone's status or influence can result in punishment, reduced rations, or assignment to the most dangerous duties. The work schedule aboard the ship follows no regular pattern, with duties assigned based on immediate needs, weather conditions, and the officer's arbitrary decisions. You might work continuously for 20 hours during a storm, then have periods of relative inactivity when weather permits and no immediate threats require attention. This irregular rhythm makes it impossible to establish routines that might provide psychological stability and comfort. The tools you work with are in poor condition and constantly breaking down. Ropes fray and snap under load, pulleys seize from salt corrosion, and wooden implements crack from the stress of heavy use. Repairing and maintaining these tools becomes a constant preoccupation, as equipment failure can mean the difference between completing essential tasks and facing punishment for inadequate performance. The ship's sails, which represent your primary means of propulsion and maneuverability, require constant attention and frequent repair. The canvas is patched with scraps of cloth from various sources, creating a patchwork appearance that reflects the improvised nature of all maintenance aboard the vessel. Working with these sails means handling heavy, unwieldy materials while balancing on narrow beams high above the deck, often in high winds and rough seas. The rope work that maintains the ship's rigging has become second nature to you, but it continues to take a physical toll on your hands and arms. The constant handling of rough hemp rope creates calluses, cuts, and rope burns that never fully heal in the salt air environment. Your hands have become tools adapted to this specific work, losing the sensitivity and dexterity they once possessed. Navigation of the ship depends on instruments and techniques that seem almost magical to someone without formal training. Watching Porter work with his compass, charts, and sextant reveals the complexity of determining position and course on the featureless ocean. The mathematics involved in calculating position based on celestial observations requires education and skills that highlight the gap between your current knowledge and what would be needed to survive independently at sea. The weather patterns of the Caribbean have become a constant preoccupation as you've learned to recognize the signs that indicate approaching storms, changes in wind direction, and other conditions that affect the ship's operations. Reading clouds, feeling changes in air pressure, and observing wave patterns provide information that can mean the difference between safety and disaster for a sailing vessel. Storms at sea represent some of the most terrifying experiences you've endured during your time aboard the pirate ship. The combination of towering waves, driving rain, high winds, and the constant threat of the ship breaking apart creates conditions that test human endurance beyond its normal limits. During the worst storms, survival becomes a matter of holding on and hoping that the vessel's construction proves adequate to withstand forces that seem designed to destroy anything human-made. Your first major storm as a crew member occurred 3 months after you joined the ship, and the experience taught you respect for the ocean's power that no amount of preparation could have provided. Waves taller than buildings crashed over the ship's bow, flooding the deck with tons of water that had to drain quickly or risk swamping the vessel. The wind howled with a sound that seemed to come from hell itself, making communication impossible except through gestures and physical contact. During that storm, you were assigned to work aloft, adjusting sails to prevent them from being torn apart by the wind. Climbing the rigging in calm weather is challenging enough, but doing so while the ship pitches and rolls violently in heavy seas requires a combination of skill, courage, and luck that you didn't know you possessed. The sensation of being flung through space while clinging to a rope 90 feet above a deck that's alternately visible and hidden by waves remains one of the most terrifying memories of your pirate career. The storm lasted 18 hours, during which time you worked continuously without food, water, or rest. By the time the weather began to moderate, you were exhausted beyond anything you had previously experienced, your hands were bleeding from rope work, and your body was battered from being thrown against rigging and deck structures. But the storm also revealed reserves of strength and determination that you hadn't known you possessed, and surviving it gave you confidence that you could endure almost anything. The damage assessment that followed the storm revealed how close the ship had come to complete destruction. Several sails were torn beyond repair, requiring careful rationing of the remaining canvas and reduced speed until replacements could be obtained. The main mast had developed a crack that required emergency reinforcement with iron bands salvaged from captured cargo. Most seriously, the hull had been strained enough to open several seams, requiring constant pumping to prevent the ship from taking on too much water. The repair work that followed consumed weeks of effort by every able-bodied crew member. Sail repair required skills in needlework that few of the crew possessed, leading to crude patches that reduced the efficiency of the ship's propulsion system. Mast repair involved carpentry work that tested Philadelphia Pete's skills and required materials that were difficult to obtain through legitimate means. Hull repair proved to be the most challenging task, requiring the ship to be careened, deliberately run aground on a beach so that the underwater portions could be accessed for work. This process exposed the crew to additional dangers from hostile natives, rival pirates, and naval forces while the ship was helpless to escape or defend itself effectively. The careening process revealed the full extent of damage that had accumulated during months at sea. The hull was riddled with holes created by marine borers, small organisms that eat away at wooden ships in tropical waters. The copper sheathing that should have protected against such damage had been lost or damaged, leaving the vessel vulnerable to destruction from within by creatures too small to see but collectively capable of sinking the ship. The repairs required materials and skills that highlighted how dependent pirate crews are on the legitimate maritime infrastructure they're supposedly rebelling against. Copper sheathing, quality timber, proper tools, and skilled craftsmen are all products of organized society that pirates cannot replace through their own efforts. The criminal lifestyle that seems to offer independence actually creates dependencies that make long-term survival increasingly difficult. The social dynamics during the careening period revealed new aspects of crew relationships that had been hidden during normal sailing operations. With the ship immobilized and the crew forced to work closely together on land, personality conflicts and power struggles that had been suppressed by the demands of sea survival emerged in full force. You witnessed several violent confrontations between crew members who had been forced to suppress their mutual hostility while the ship's survival depended on cooperation. These fights served as reminders that the apparent unity of the pirate crew was largely a product of shared danger rather than genuine friendship or loyalty. The opportunity to spend time on land, even the desolate beach where the ship was careened, provided psychological relief that emphasized how oppressive life aboard the vessel had become. The simple ability to walk in a straight line for more than a few steps, to see horizons that weren't limited by the ship's railings, and to experience silence broken only by natural sounds rather than the constant noise of shipboard life represented luxuries that you had forgotten existed. But the beach also presented new dangers and challenges that reminded you why the ship, for all its miseries, provided essential protection against the hostile environment of the Caribbean. Mosquitoes and other insects attacked relentlessly, carrying diseases that could prove fatal. Fresh water was scarce and difficult to locate. Food sources were limited to whatever could be gathered from tide pools and the few edible plants that grew in the sandy soil. The native populations of the islands where pirates typically careen their ships have learned to avoid contact with European crews, but signs of their presence, footprints, abandoned campsites, glimpses of figures watching from the jungle, serve as constant reminders that the crew is trespassing on territory where they're not welcome and where hostile action could occur at any time. The completion of repairs and the successful refloating of the ship marked the end of the most peaceful period you had experienced since joining the crew. Despite the hard work, constant mosquito attacks, and primitive living conditions, the time on land had provided a respite from the claustrophobic intensity of shipboard life that made returning to sea seem like a return to prison. The ship's performance after the repairs proved to be significantly worse than before the storm damage. The patched sails provided less efficient propulsion, the reinforced mast created additional weight and wind resistance, and the crude hull repairs reduced the vessel's speed and maneuverability. These performance decreases translated directly into reduced ability to escape from naval vessels and decreased effectiveness in pursuing merchant prey. The psychological impact of the ship's declining condition affected the entire crew's morale and behavior. Men who had previously shown discipline and cooperation began to exhibit increased irritability, fatalism, and willingness to take desperate risks. The realization that the vessel was slowly deteriorating despite their best efforts to maintain it created a sense of doom that influenced every aspect of daily life. Food security became an even more pressing concern as the ship's reduced performance made successful hunting of merchant vessels more difficult. Failed attacks consumed supplies without providing replacement resources, creating a downward spiral that threatened the crew's survival even without external threats from naval forces or rival pirates. The failed attack on a Spanish treasure galleon 3 weeks after the storm repairs illustrated how dramatically the ship's capabilities had been reduced. What should have been a routine capture of a valuable prize turned into a humiliating retreat when the galleon's superior speed and firepower proved more than a match for your damaged vessel. The retreat itself became a running battle that lasted 6 hours and cost the lives of 4 crew members while accomplishing nothing except the consumption of precious gunpowder and the revelation of the ship's weakness to potential enemies. The dead crew members included Jonas, the former merchant sailor whose infected leg wound had never properly healed, struck down by a Spanish musket ball that tore through his chest. Jonas's death affected you more than the previous casualties you had witnessed, partly because you had come to know him as an individual rather than simply another crew member. His stories of his former life as a legitimate sailor, his obvious regret at being forced into piracy, and his quiet kindness toward newer crew members had made him one of the few people aboard the ship whom you considered a friend. The burial of Jonas and the other casualties at sea followed the same perfunctory ritual that had marked previous deaths, but this time you found yourself wondering about the families they had left behind and the legitimate lives they had abandoned or been forced to abandon. The realization that you yourself might die in such circumstances, with no one to mourn your passing or remember your existence, created a sense of isolation and despair that threatened to overwhelm your determination to survive. The crew's response to the failed attack and mounting casualties revealed the fragility of the social bonds that held the group together. Conversations that had previously focused on shared plans and common goals increasingly centered on individual escape strategies and personal survival concerns. The collective identity that had sustained the crew during previous hardships began to fragment as each man confronted the possibility that their pirate career might end in violent death rather than comfortable retirement. Captain Blackbeard's reaction to the failed attack demonstrated the arbitrary violence that characterized his leadership style. Rather than analyzing the tactical mistakes that had led to failure or addressing the ship's performance problems, he chose to execute one of the crew members as an example to the others. The victim, a quiet man named Harrison who had served aboard the ship for over a year, was accused of cowardice during the battle and shot through the head while the entire crew watched. Harrison's execution served no practical purpose except to reinforce Blackbeard's authority through terror, but it also illustrated the captain's growing instability under the pressure of mounting failures and reduced options. The random nature of the punishment, Harrison had actually performed adequately during the battle, created anxiety among all crew members about their own safety and the arbitrariness of the captain's justice. The atmosphere aboard the ship following the execution became even more oppressive as crew members realized that their lives could be ended at any moment based on the captain's whims rather than their actual performance or behavior. Conversations became more guarded, work was performed with exaggerated diligence, and everyone avoided drawing attention to themselves in any way that might be interpreted as challenging authority. Your own response to Harrison's murder was to become even more invisible and compliant, avoiding eye contact with officers and performing assigned duties with mechanical precision that drew no notice. But internally, you began to plan more seriously for escape opportunities, understanding that remaining aboard the ship indefinitely would likely result in death either from violence, disease, or the general deterioration of living conditions. The ship's water situation reached crisis levels 2 weeks after Harrison's execution, with remaining supplies sufficient for perhaps 10 more days at reduced rations. The search for fresh water became the crew's primary concern, overriding all other considerations including the pursuit of merchant vessels that might contain valuable cargo. The desperate search for water led to increasingly risky decisions about where to make landfall and how long to remain exposed in potentially hostile territories. The crew found themselves drinking from streams that might be contaminated, trading with natives who had every reason to poison or attack European intruders, and venturing into territories controlled by Spanish forces that had standing orders to kill pirates on sight. Your own experience with extreme dehydration during this period provided education in the physical and psychological effects of water deprivation that no academic study could have conveyed. The constant thirst became an obsession that dominated all other thoughts and made concentration on necessary tasks nearly impossible. Your urine turned dark and scanty, your skin lost elasticity, and your thinking became increasingly confused and irrational. The crew's discovery of a spring on a small uninhabited island provided temporary salvation, but the process of collecting and storing sufficient water for future needs required back-breaking labor under the tropical sun while maintaining constant vigilance against potential threats. The work involved carrying heavy containers across rough terrain while fighting off swarms of insects and dealing with the disorientation that resulted from recent dehydration. The physical labor required for water collection revealed how much your strength and endurance had deteriorated during months of inadequate nutrition and harsh living conditions. Tasks that would have been routine during your former life as a carpenter's apprentice now required enormous effort and frequent rest periods. Your body had adapted to survival on minimal resources, but this adaptation came at the cost of reduced capabilities that made every aspect of life more difficult. The temporary abundance of fresh water that resulted from the collection efforts created a brief period of improved morale and physical condition for the crew, but it also highlighted how precarious your situation had become. The knowledge that survival depended on finding such resources at regular intervals while avoiding the naval forces and rival pirates who might contest access to them created constant anxiety about the future. The improved water situation allowed Captain Blackbeard to resume actively hunting merchant vessels, but the ship's reduced performance and the crew's deteriorated condition made success increasingly unlikely. The attacks you participated in during this period were characterized by desperation and poor planning that reflected the growing pressure on the captain to produce results despite increasingly unfavorable circumstances. The attack on a Portuguese merchant vessel carrying sugar and coffee from Brazil illustrated the declining effectiveness of your pirate crew. What should have been a straightforward capture turned into a prolonged battle when the merchant crew decided to resist rather than surrender. The Portuguese sailors, perhaps sensing the weakness of their attackers, fought with determination that surprised the pirates and resulted in casualties on both sides. Your own performance during this battle reflected the cumulative effects of months of poor nutrition, inadequate rest, and chronic stress. Movements that had once been quick and sure became slow and uncertain. Reactions that had previously been instinctive now required conscious thought that made you vulnerable to enemy action. Most disturbing of all, you found yourself hesitating at crucial moments, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty that could have proven fatal. The eventual capture of the Portuguese vessel provided some desperately needed supplies, but the cost in crew casualties and expended resources made the victory Pyrrhic at best. 3 more crew members died during the battle, including the ship's master gunner, whose knowledge of artillery was irreplaceable. The wounded included 2 men with injuries serious enough to make them permanent burdens on the crew's limited resources. The captured supplies included food and water that provided temporary relief, but they also included information that created new concerns about the crew's future prospects. Papers found aboard the Portuguese vessel revealed that naval forces throughout the Caribbean had been alerted to the Queen Anne's Revenge's presence and were actively coordinating efforts to locate and destroy the ship. The intelligence about naval operations made it clear that the safe havens and friendly ports that had previously been available to the crew were rapidly disappearing. The net was closing around all pirate operations in the Caribbean, and ships like yours that had gained reputations for particular violence were being specifically targeted for elimination. The crew's reaction to this intelligence varied from denial to panic, with some members insisting that the information was false or exaggerated while others began openly discussing desertion and surrender options. The fragmentation of crew unity that had begun after recent failures accelerated as individual survival instincts overcame collective loyalty and shared purpose. Captain Blackbeard's response to the intelligence reports demonstrated his growing isolation from reality and his inability to adapt to changing circumstances. Rather than acknowledging the deteriorating strategic situation and considering options for preserving what remained of his crew, he doubled down on increasingly aggressive tactics that maximized risk while offering minimal potential for meaningful success. The captain's plan to attack a Spanish convoy that was reportedly carrying significant treasure required dividing the already depleted crew and taking enormous risks for uncertain rewards. The convoy was heavily guarded, traveled in well-defended waters, and represented the kind of target that required careful planning and superior resources to attack successfully. Your assignment to the boarding party for the convoy attack filled you with dread, as previous experience had taught you that such operations were essentially suicide missions for common crew members. The boarding party would be expected to assault heavily defended vessels using inadequate weapons while facing professional soldiers trained specifically for such combat. The night before the planned attack, you lay in your cramped sleeping space contemplating the very real possibility that you would not survive the following day. The combination of facing superior enemy forces, fighting alongside increasingly desperate and unreliable crewmates, and using weapons that might misfire at crucial moments created odds that no rational person would accept voluntarily. The pre-battle preparations revealed the full extent of the crew's deterioration and the inadequacy of their equipment for the planned assault. Weapons were cleaned and sharpened as much as possible, but many showed signs of damage and wear that made them unreliable. Gunpowder was distributed sparingly due to limited supplies, and some crew members received no firearms at all, being expected to fight with cutlasses and improvised weapons. The approach to the Spanish convoy took place during pre-dawn darkness that was supposed to provide concealment but actually increased the danger of the operation by making coordination between crew members nearly impossible. The plan, such as it was, required precise timing and seamless cooperation that the fragmented and demoralized crew was no longer capable of achieving. The attack itself unfolded as the disaster that anyone with tactical knowledge could have predicted. The Spanish convoy was better prepared and more heavily defended than expected, with professional soldiers who responded to the pirate assault with disciplined volleys of musket fire that cut down attackers before they could reach the enemy vessels. You found yourself trapped on the deck of a Spanish ship, surrounded by enemy soldiers and fighting for your life with a rusty cutlass against opponents armed with superior weapons and fighting with the coordination of trained military units. The battle became a nightmare of smoke, blood, and screaming that seemed to last forever while actually ending in less than 20 minutes. The retreat from the failed attack was more harrowing than the assault itself, as the surviving pirates struggled to return to their own vessel while under constant fire from Spanish forces who showed no mercy to anyone attempting to escape. You reached the Queen Anne's Revenge with a sword cut across your ribs that bled freely and several musket balls that had passed close enough to burn your clothing. The casualties from the convoy attack were catastrophic for a crew that could not afford to lose any more members. 8 men died during the assault, including Quartermaster Wickham, whose death created a leadership vacuum that further destabilized the ship's organization. Another 6 crew members suffered wounds serious enough to make them unable to perform essential duties. The failed attack also consumed the last of the ship's gunpowder reserves and resulted in the loss of several weapons that had been dropped during the chaotic retreat. These material losses, combined with the human casualties, left the crew in a position where meaningful resistance to future threats would be impossible. Captain Blackbeard's reaction to the disaster revealed the complete breakdown of his leadership capabilities and his descent into the kind of madness that extreme stress can produce in men who lack the psychological resources to cope with failure. His response was to execute 2 more crew members, chosen apparently at random, while ranting about betrayal and cowardice that existed primarily in his own fevered imagination. The arbitrary executions removed any pretense that the ship operated according to rational principles or that crew members could influence their fate through their own actions and behavior. The realization that survival now depended entirely on the whims of a madman created a level of despair and hopelessness that made continued existence seem pointless. Your own emotional response to the executions and the general deterioration of your situation included thoughts of suicide that would have been unthinkable during your former life. The combination of physical misery, constant fear, and complete absence of hope for improvement created a psychological state where death seemed preferable to continued suffering. But even in your darkest moments, some stubborn instinct for survival prevented you from acting on these suicidal impulses. Perhaps it was the memory of your former life and the possibility, however remote, that you might someday escape your current circumstances and return to civilization. Perhaps it was simply the biological drive to continue living that exists in all creatures regardless of their circumstances. The ship's final weeks were characterized by a steady deterioration of all systems and relationships that made normal operations increasingly impossible. Food supplies dwindled to almost nothing, forcing the crew to subsist on whatever fish could be caught and the occasional seabird that could be brought down with stones or improvised weapons. Water rationing became so severe that fights broke out over access to the remaining supplies, and several crew members were caught attempting to steal from the communal stores despite the death penalty that such theft carried. The social bonds that had held the crew together during previous hardships completely dissolved as individual desperation overcame any sense of collective responsibility. The ship itself began to show signs of structural failure that made continued sailing increasingly dangerous. Seams in the hull that had been improperly repaired during the careening period began to open again, requiring constant pumping to prevent the vessel from taking on enough water to sink. The mainmast, weakened by storm damage and crude repairs, developed additional cracks that threatened to bring down the entire sail system. Navigation became increasingly difficult as the ship's instruments were damaged or lost and Navigator Porter's health deteriorated to the point where he could barely function. The crew found themselves sailing essentially blind, unable to determine their exact position or plot courses to desired destinations with any accuracy. The end, when it came, arrived with the suddenness that characterizes most disasters at sea. A Royal Navy frigate appeared on the horizon one morning, flying colors that identified it as HMS Pearl, a vessel specifically assigned to hunt down known pirate ships. The frigate's superior speed and firepower made escape impossible, especially given the Queen Anne's Revenge's deteriorated condition. Captain Blackbeard's final act of madness was to order an attack on the naval vessel despite the impossibility of success and the certainty that such an attack would result in the death of everyone aboard the pirate ship. The crew's response was mutiny, not the organized rebellion of popular tales, but the simple refusal of exhausted, starving men to commit suicide for a leader who had lost all connection to reality. The confrontation between Blackbeard and his crew ended when the captain was shot by his own first mate, Robert McLean, in what could only be described as an act of mercy for everyone involved. Blackbeard's death removed the last obstacle to surrender, though by then it was too late to prevent the final tragedy that would end your pirate career. The HMS Pearl's attack on the Queen Anne's Revenge was swift and decisive, with professional gunners using superior weapons to systematically destroy a vessel that could offer no meaningful resistance. The first broadside killed half the remaining crew and started fires that quickly spread throughout the ship's timber structure. You found yourself in the water, struggling to stay afloat while debris from the destroyed ship rained down around you and the flames that consumed what had been your home for 8 months cast dancing shadows on the waves. The shock of sudden immersion in seawater, combined with the injuries you had sustained during the battle, made survival a minute-by-minute struggle that required every ounce of strength you still possessed. The Royal Navy's response to survivors in the water was efficient but not merciful. Those who were rescued were immediately shackled and prepared for transport to the nearest port where they would face trial for piracy, a trial that would almost certainly end in execution by hanging. Your own rescue, if it could be called that, came when a naval longboat pulled you from the water just as you were losing the strength to keep your head above the surface. The sailors who hauled you aboard treated you with the casual brutality reserved for condemned criminals, and the shackles they placed around your wrists and ankles served as reminders that your ordeal was far from over. The voyage to Port Royal aboard HMS Pearl provided your first experience with how legitimate naval vessels operated, and the contrast with your recent experiences aboard the pirate ship was stark and depressing. The naval crew worked with discipline and efficiency that made the chaos of pirate operations seem like the desperate improvisations they actually were. The food aboard the naval vessel, while simple, was clean and adequate in quantity. The crew quarters, though cramped, were organized and maintained according to standards that prioritized health and efficiency. Most importantly, the social relationships among the naval crew were governed by regulations and traditions that provided predictability and security for everyone involved. But these observations of naval life served only to emphasize how completely you had destroyed your own future through your association with piracy. The comfortable existence of legitimate sailors was now forever beyond your reach, and the fate that awaited you in Port Royal would end any possibility of returning to civilized society. The trial, when it finally took place, was a perfunctory affair that served more as public entertainment than as a search for justice. The evidence against you was overwhelming and undeniable, consisting of your own presence aboard a known pirate vessel and the testimony of naval officers who had witnessed your participation in criminal activities. Your execution, like those of the other surviving crew members, was carried out publicly as a warning to others who might be tempted by the supposed romance of piracy. The crowd that gathered to watch the hangings was large and enthusiastic, viewing the proceedings as entertainment rather than the tragic end of human lives that had been corrupted by circumstances beyond their control. As you stood on the gallows with the rope around your neck, facing the final moments of a life that had begun with such different aspirations, you reflected on the journey that had brought you to this point. The romantic dreams of adventure and easy wealth that had first attracted you to piracy had been replaced by the harsh reality of violence, disease, hunger, and degradation that characterized life outside civilized society. But perhaps most tragically, you realized that your story was not unique. Throughout the Caribbean, other young men were making the same fateful decisions that had led you to this moment, drawn by the same false promises and romantic fantasies that ignored the brutal realities of criminal life at sea. The lessons of your experience, that crime offers no real escape from society's constraints, that violence corrupts those who embrace it, and that the pursuit of easy wealth leads inevitably to destruction, were lessons that each generation would have to learn anew through their own suffering and tragedy. In these final moments, as the executioner prepared to end your brief and brutal career as a pirate, you understood that your story served as a warning about the seductive power of dreams that promise freedom but deliver only slavery to violence, desperation, and death. The pirate's life that had seemed so appealing from a distance had proven to be a trap that destroyed everyone who entered it, leaving behind only cautionary tales for those wise enough to learn from others' mistakes. The rope tightened around your neck, and your last conscious thought was a prayer that others might be spared the suffering you had endured by choosing the harder but more honorable path of legitimate work, no matter how difficult or unrewarding it might seem compared to the false promises of piracy. But let us step back from that final moment and consider the broader tragedy that your story represents, not just the personal destruction of one young man's life, but the systematic way that the harsh realities of colonial society created the conditions that made piracy seem like a viable alternative to legitimate existence. Your journey to that gallows began not with any inherent criminal tendencies, but with the limited opportunities available to working-class men in the early 18th century Caribbean. As a carpenter's apprentice in Port Royal, you had witnessed firsthand how the colonial economy offered little hope for advancement to those without family connections or capital to invest in trade ventures. The legal maritime trades, merchant sailing, naval service, fishing, were controlled by established interests that offered subsistence wages and brutal working conditions to common sailors. The stories of former shipmates who had turned to piracy and supposedly found wealth and freedom provided a stark contrast to the grinding poverty and servitude that characterized legitimate maritime employment. What these stories failed to convey was the temporary nature of any success that pirates might achieve and the inevitable consequences of living outside the law. The wealth that successful pirates accumulated was quickly spent on temporary pleasures, and the freedom they enjoyed was actually a form of exile that cut them off from all the benefits and protections of civilized society. Your own experience aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge demonstrated how quickly the supposed advantages of pirate life disappeared when confronted with the practical realities of survival at sea. The democracy that supposedly governed pirate ships proved to be mob rule dominated by the most violent and intimidating personalities. The wealth that piracy promised turned out to be meager and irregularly obtained, insufficient to compensate for the constant danger and degradation of criminal life. Most fundamentally, the freedom that piracy offered was revealed to be an illusion. Rather than escaping the constraints of legitimate society, pirates simply exchanged one set of limitations for another, far more brutal set. Instead of answering to employers and authorities who were bound by law and tradition, pirates found themselves subject to the arbitrary will of captains whose power was limited only by their ability to maintain control through violence and intimidation. The social structure aboard pirate ships, despite its democratic pretensions, was actually more rigid and oppressive than the class hierarchies of legitimate society. While a carpenter's apprentice on land might hope to eventually establish his own business and achieve some measure of independence, a common crew member aboard a pirate ship had virtually no opportunity for advancement and could expect his situation to deteriorate steadily until death or capture ended his career. The economic system of piracy, which appeared to offer immediate rewards for relatively little effort, was actually far less efficient and reliable than legitimate trade. The time and resources invested in hunting merchant vessels, fighting battles, and evading naval forces could have produced far greater wealth if applied to productive activities within the legal economy. Moreover, the wealth that pirates did obtain was largely illusory, consisting of goods that were difficult to convert to useful currency and treasure that had to be hidden or quickly spent to avoid confiscation by authorities. The romantic image of pirates burying treasure for future use was largely fiction created by the practical reality that stolen goods were worthless unless they could be safely converted to useful resources. The social costs of piracy extended far beyond the individual crew members who chose this way of life. Every successful pirate attack raised the costs of legitimate maritime trade, making goods more expensive for ordinary consumers and reducing the economic opportunities available to law-abiding merchants and sailors. The naval resources devoted to hunting pirates could have been used for more productive purposes, and the ports that served as pirate havens became centers of violence and corruption that damaged entire regional economies. The human costs of piracy were even more devastating than the economic impacts. Merchant sailors who fell victim to pirate attacks often faced torture, murder, or forced recruitment into criminal crews. Passengers aboard captured vessels might be held for ransom, assaulted, or killed for entertainment. Entire communities lived in fear of pirate raids that could destroy years of hard work and development in a matter of hours. Your own participation in these crimes, however reluctant, made you complicit in a system of violence and exploitation that caused immeasurable suffering to innocent people. The merchant sailors you helped to capture and sometimes kill were men much like yourself, working people trying to support families and build better lives through honest labor. Their death served no purpose except to satisfy the greed and bloodlust of men who had chosen to live as predators. The psychological damage that this violence inflicted on its perpetrators was perhaps as severe as the harm done to victims. The process of becoming capable of murder and theft required suppressing the moral instincts and emotional connections that make civilized life possible. Men who embraced piracy found themselves becoming progressively more isolated from normal human relationships and increasingly dependent on violence as their primary means of solving problems. The degradation of character that piracy required was irreversible for most who experienced it. Even if they somehow managed to escape the criminal life and return to legitimate society, former pirates carried with them the psychological scars of violence and the practical burden of a criminal past that made normal relationships and employment nearly impossible to maintain. The social isolation that resulted from these changes often drove former pirates back to criminal activity, creating a cycle of violence and degradation that was extremely difficult to break. Communities that might have welcomed reformed criminals were understandably reluctant to trust men whose recent past included rape, murder, and theft as routine activities. The medical consequences of pirate life, while perhaps less obvious than the social and legal problems, were equally devastating and often irreversible. The malnutrition, disease, and exposure that characterized life aboard pirate ships caused permanent damage to physical health that could never be fully repaired even if adequate medical care later became available. Scurvy, the vitamin deficiency disease that plagued all long-distance sailors but was particularly severe aboard pirate ships due to their limited access to fresh provisions, caused dental problems, bone weakness, and organ damage that persisted even after the immediate symptoms were treated. Men who survived severe cases of scurvy often suffered from chronic pain and reduced physical capabilities for the remainder of their lives. The various tropical diseases that spread rapidly through pirate crews in the confined conditions of ship life often caused recurring symptoms that made reliable employment impossible even for those who managed to return to legitimate society. Malaria, yellow fever, and other ailments could flare up unpredictably, leaving former pirates unable to maintain the consistent work performance that employers required. The injuries sustained during battles and the harsh physical labor of ship maintenance often resulted in permanent disabilities that further reduced former pirates' ability to support themselves through legitimate means. Men who lost limbs, suffered brain damage from head injuries, or developed chronic pain conditions found themselves dependent on charity or forced to return to criminal activities simply to survive. Perhaps most tragically, the financial rewards that motivated men to accept these risks and hardships were largely illusory. While a few pirate captains accumulated significant wealth during brief periods of success, the vast majority of pirates lived in poverty that was often worse than what they would have experienced in legitimate employment. The expenses associated with maintaining a pirate crew, purchasing weapons and ammunition, repairing storm damage, replacing equipment lost in battles, and providing minimal food and medical care for crew members, consumed most of whatever wealth was captured from merchant vessels. The irregular nature of pirate income meant that crews often went months without any significant captures, during which time they had to survive on whatever resources they had managed to accumulate during previous successes. The division of captured wealth according to pirate articles typically left common crew members with shares that barely compensated for the risks they had taken and the hardships they had endured. After accounting for the time spent searching for targets, fighting battles, and recovering from injuries or illness, most pirates earned less than they could have made in legitimate employment that offered regular wages and some measure of security. The inability to invest captured wealth in legitimate enterprises or secure financial instruments meant that pirates had no opportunity to build long-term financial security. Money that could not be deposited in banks, invested in land or businesses, or converted to pension arrangements was essentially worthless for providing security against old age, injury, or economic downturns. The constant threat of capture and execution meant that pirates could never make long-term plans or investments that required time to mature. This short-term thinking reinforced the cycle of violence and immediate gratification that characterized pirate culture and prevented the development of the kinds of social institutions that could have provided alternatives to criminal activity. The educational and cultural impoverishment that resulted from life outside civilized society was another hidden cost of piracy that affected men's ability to function normally even if they managed to escape their criminal careers. Extended periods away from books, schools, religious institutions, and other sources of intellectual and moral development left former pirates ill-equipped to participate in the increasingly complex social and economic systems of the 18th century. The isolation from family relationships and normal community life meant that pirates missed opportunities to develop the social skills and emotional maturity that were essential for success in legitimate society. Men who spent their formative years in the violent, all-male environment of pirate ships often found themselves unable to form healthy relationships with women or to function effectively as fathers and community members. The absence of moral and spiritual guidance during crucial developmental years left many pirates without the ethical framework necessary to make good decisions when faced with complex choices in later life. The utilitarian morality of pirate society, which valued only immediate survival and material gain, provided no foundation for the kinds of principled decision-making that legitimate society required. As we reflect on your story and the broader tragedy it represents, it becomes clear that piracy was not a romantic adventure or a viable alternative to legitimate society, but rather a trap that destroyed everyone who entered it. The apparent freedom and wealth that attracted young men like yourself were mirages that disappeared as soon as they were closely examined, leaving behind only suffering, degradation, and death. The real tragedy was not that some men chose to become pirates, but that the social and economic conditions of colonial society made piracy seem like a reasonable choice to people who saw no other opportunities for advancement or escape from poverty. The rigid class hierarchies, limited economic opportunities, and harsh working conditions that characterized legitimate employment in the Caribbean created a pool of desperate men who were vulnerable to the false promises of criminal recruiters. The solution to piracy, therefore, lay not in more vigorous prosecution of individual criminals, but in addressing the underlying social conditions that made crime seem attractive to otherwise decent people. Societies that provided genuine opportunities for advancement, fair wages for honest work, and safety nets for those who fell on hard times found that piracy virtually disappeared without the need for massive enforcement efforts. The lessons of your experience remain relevant today, as societies continue to struggle with the relationship between legitimate opportunity and criminal activity. The romantic appeal of easy wealth and freedom from social constraints continues to attract people to various forms of criminal enterprise, and the consequences for those who succumb to these temptations remain as devastating as they were in the golden age of piracy. The human capacity for self-deception that allowed you and your crewmates to believe that you could find happiness and success through violence and theft continues to operate in modern criminal organizations. The same psychological mechanisms that convinced 18th-century sailors that piracy offered a path to freedom and wealth now convince drug dealers, gang members, and other criminals that their chosen lifestyle will provide them with the satisfaction and security that they seek. The cycle of violence and degradation that characterized pirate crews can be observed in modern criminal organizations that promise brotherhood and loyalty while actually exploiting their members' desperation and destroying their capacity for normal human relationships. The initiation processes, hierarchical structures, and codes of conduct that govern gang activity serve the same function as pirate articles, creating the illusion of order and purpose while actually facilitating exploitation and violence. The economic reality of modern criminal activity mirrors the financial illusions of historical piracy. While a few highly visible criminals may accumulate significant wealth, the vast majority of participants in illegal enterprises earn less than they could make in legitimate employment while exposing themselves to risks that far exceed any potential rewards. The social costs of modern crime continue to mirror those of historical piracy, with entire communities suffering from the violence, corruption, and economic disruption that criminal activity creates. The resources devoted to law enforcement and criminal justice could be used more productively to address the underlying social problems that drive people to crime in the first place. As you faced those final moments on the gallows in Port Royal, your life served as a testament to the enduring truth that crime offers no real escape from the constraints and difficulties of legitimate society. The freedom that piracy promised was revealed to be slavery to violence, fear, and degradation. The wealth it offered was shown to be poverty of both material circumstances and human relationships. The adventure it provided was demonstrated to be merely suffering without purpose or meaning. Your story reminds us that human beings have always faced the temptation to seek easy solutions to difficult problems, and that this temptation becomes particularly strong when legitimate opportunities seem limited or unattainable. But it also demonstrates that these easy solutions inevitably prove to be traps that make the original problems worse while creating new difficulties that are far more serious than the challenges they were meant to solve. The true adventure, the real freedom, and the genuine wealth that you sought could only have been found through the patient, difficult work of building a legitimate life within the constraints of civilized society. The carpenter's skills that you abandoned when you joined Blackbeard's crew could have provided the foundation for a successful business, a comfortable family life, and the respect of your community. The social connections you severed when you chose crime could have supported you through difficult times and provided meaning and purpose to your existence. But perhaps most importantly, the moral integrity that you sacrificed when you participated in theft and murder could have given you the peace of mind and self-respect that no amount of stolen treasure could ever provide. The ability to sleep peacefully at night, to look at yourself in a mirror without shame, and to face death without the burden of unforgivable crimes, these were the true treasures that piracy forced you to abandon. In the end, your brief career as a pirate serves as a powerful reminder that the choices we make in response to life's challenges define not only our external circumstances but our very identity as human beings. The decision to embrace violence and crime, regardless of the circumstances that seem to justify it, inevitably leads to the destruction of everything that makes life worth living. As the rope tightened around your neck and your consciousness faded for the final time, your story became part of a larger narrative about human nature, social justice, and the eternal struggle between our better angels and our darker impulses. That story continues today, written in the lives of people who face similar choices and must decide whether to seek solutions within the framework of civilized society or to pursue the false promises of criminal alternatives. The misery you experienced aboard that pirate ship, the hunger, disease, violence, and despair that characterized every moment of your existence, stands as an eternal warning about the true cost of choosing the easy path over the right path. Your suffering was not heroic or romantic, but tragically unnecessary, the result of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time but led inevitably to destruction and death. And so, as we reach the end of this long, dark journey through one of history's most brutal realities, we're left with the sobering recognition that the line between civilization and barbarism is far thinner than most people realize, and that crossing it, even with the best of intentions, leads to consequences that no one can fully anticipate or control. Your story reminds us that true freedom comes not from escaping society's constraints, but from finding meaningful ways to contribute to the common good while building lives of dignity, purpose, and connection to our fellow human beings. The waves that washed your blood from the deck of the Queen Anne's Revenge also carried away the dreams and aspirations that had once defined your identity, leaving behind only the harsh lesson that some choices, once made, cannot be undone, and that the pursuit of easy wealth and freedom from responsibility leads inevitably to a poverty of spirit that no amount of treasure can alleviate. In the quiet darkness of tonight, as you drift toward sleep in the safety and comfort of your modern world, remember that the security you enjoy was built by countless generations of people who chose the harder path of legitimate work and social cooperation over the false promises of criminal enterprise. Their sacrifices created the civilization that protects you from the kind of choices that led to such misery aboard those pirate ships of long ago.